So I'm perfect. I think we are starting to record here. Good. Hello, everyone. Actually, it's 17 minutes, and I had a certain amount of time, and the question is, should I take up my hour or should I put a punch at the beginning? And so I'm actually going to start this with a punch. And this video is let's let it speak for itself. So wish me luck that my technical capabilities will get it on and you'll be able to hear it. Right. And if anybody could just give me a thumbs up or yes, they can see and hear it in a minute, I'll get it up here. All right. First of all, can you see it?
We can see it.
All right. Perfect. Now I'm going to play it. Thank you.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and the project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540 square foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of 1 or 2 real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aimed to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, Public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow of the football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. none of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have three provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship, which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
All right, I am back. Let's first of all clarify. Can you guys see me? Can you see me, someone?
Yes.
Perfect. Whoa. That and our organizers will get you a link to that video so that we can properly source that, and so you know where that's from. And so I appreciate that if we can get that out to folks via the chat. But let me just say, whoa, that was interesting, right? Heavy duty. I played that video because I wanted to evoke emotion. I wanted to, how did you feel? I mean, were there folks that are white that felt really uncomfortable about just how white folks were presented into this video? Were there African Americans that felt like, gosh darn right, that's the truth, and maybe thinking that only African Americans are the only ones that have received some social injustice? Are there Latinos that think, why is it always that we're talking about African Americans? Like, why can't we be a part of this? And then, of course, do we have our Asian community that's like, we aren't even anywhere near this conversation, even though we see the numbers increasing? I can go on and on and on. And the reason why I played this video is because I think it's time that we have to get beyond the shock of disparity in order for us to sit in the space that we can begin to impact equity. And so if you think about that, and that's what a majority of my conversation today is, that I was introduced a little bit differently, but as I thought carefully of me speaking to some of the practitioners and to the future of those in community development and community planning, is that we have to really understand this concept and thought process of thinking equitably in the work that we do. And equity seems to be a real hot topic right now, right? I mean, it's equitable planning, equitable design, looking at everything through an equitable lens. We hear that, but to me, you know, I felt like in order for me to be equitable in the work that I do, I had to understand those that I served at an intrinsic level. And so then the question is probably asked, like, why should this matter to you? I think that's a really important topic, or excuse me, question. Why should this matter to you? And I ask for you to continually ask yourself through this, through your growth, to those that are in the business right now, is to ask that question, why should it matter to me? Why should I care about equality and equity in the work that I'm doing? Well, I'm here to give you some of the personal reasons as to why it matters to me. And hopefully you can identify with some of those reasons going forward. As you can see how I've applied it to my life, my work, and I go to sleep very well. And I wake up feeling really good about myself also, because I know kind of the authentic and real approach to the work that I do. So why should it matter to you? Honestly, I think it's because of personal value. Personal value. And I think there's 4 types of value that you should really think about when it comes to understanding the personal value that you get from thinking equitably in the work that you do in commercial real estate, or excuse me, commercial or real estate development, community development. First of all, functional value. And so this type of value is what an offer does. It's the solution an offer promises to the community. And so I'll give you an example on that. At WHEDA, I have the privilege of leading a wonderful organization that puts out resources for housing and economic development. And one of the communities or constituency stakeholders that we support are the tribes. There's 19 sovereign tribes in the state of Wisconsin. And in our work, we've been listening to them, hearing what's going on with you all. COVID hit the tribes very hard. Couple reasons, because a significant amount of the tribes received casino revenue. And you know, during during COVID, that income wasn't coming in. Some of the tribes, excuse me, some of the casinos actually closed down. So imagine the impact that had. On top of the fact that even prior to COVID, there was a significant need for the tribes to think about diversifying their revenue, about housing and how it supports the well-being of their community. These were things that were very important. And they came to WHEDA saying, WHEDA, we need housing. Are there tools within your toolbox to help us build the housing to support our communities? And we looked at them like, yeah, we've had these tools all along. You've known about them. Why aren't you using them? We point our finger back at them. But I said, hold up. We need to take a moment to really understand, is there bias in the tools that we have? A very specific example of that is that we give out tax credits to build very large multi-family rental units in the state of Wisconsin that provide affordable rents. People have to compete for those. Developers have to compete for those. So do the tribes have to compete for those. Very, very competitive for those tax credits. We have a scoring system, and one of our points scoring system says, developer, if you come in and if we give you $1 of tax credit and you bring in $8 other from other sources, we'll give you additional points. So the more that you leverage, the more points that we give you. And when we looked at those things that developers that were not tribes, what they were leveraging tax incremental financing districts, dollars they were getting from the municipalities, tax dollars that they were getting, or premise of tax dollars that they were getting from municipalities. Now, if you think carefully, reservations are sovereign land. They are effectively their own countries. So they don't have access to those same type of dollars. That effectively, inherently is a bias against the tribes. And so we've worked very hard at looking at some of our scoring as we are right now and making the changes so that we don't have the bias against our tribes. That to me is functional value and creating a solution to help our community move forward. The next value is monetary value. Where does that come in? Well, you know what's interesting is the fact that some people think and have in their a mindset is that fact that I can't make money if I'm trying to have social impact. Like, it should be a nonprofit. There are so many amazing nonprofits that are out there that are having social impact. But it is okay to make money and have social impact as long as it's being done in that equitable nature. There's a term for that, social entrepreneurship. There are many types of businesses that are in existence today that are having significant social impact, but at the same time are making dollars. I personally am okay with that. And then for me, understanding the value that I have in being curious and knowing about others, diverse communities, has created a personal value for me. In advance of being at WHEDA, the last place I worked at was a bank, and it was a small bank that really wanted it to come into the Milwaukee area and increase its presence. But it's not that easy coming into an area where you have a significant amount of low and moderate income communities that are communities of color. Communities of color just don't have a trust of the financial systems. And so for me to represent a bank and say, hey, we're here, do banking with us. And maybe you might know about our products, you might not know anything about our products, doesn't matter. That trust isn't there. But the one thing that the CEO understood and I sold as my value proposition was my very diverse and very close network to diverse communities. And in return, that CEO paid me significantly for a value that he couldn't find out there. When he found a Latino loan officer, the Latino loan officer was only connected in the Latino community. When he found an African-American banker, he was only connected in the African-American community. My value proposition was the fact that I was able to be connected and that I was very well connected into this area. The other thing is, the truth is, right now, the work that I've been doing within the social impact of housing and economic development is the phone is ringing for me. I do have folks calling me on a national level saying, Joaquin, are you interested in this position to represent us on a national level? My mind is just blown. I'm this cat that just was born and raised on the south side of Milwaukee and only know the work that I've done regionally and now within the state. But the truth is, what I'm realizing is that our perspective, our work, what is happening here in front of us, the petri dish of Milwaukee and Wisconsin is very relevant to what's happening at a national level. And people want to know, what are we doing? People want to know what's happening. And so understand that you continue to push yourself. You continue to understand and learn and be a part of everything that's happening, disparities, the disconnect, the inequalities. You being deeply integrated to that creates that personal value for you. And then also, I can't not deny the fact that it's afforded me the ability to have a comfortable living for my family. A majority of those of color in Milwaukee live at that income level of poverty and lower. I happen to be a man of color. I am Latino, but I'm privileged beyond belief at the fact that I'm able to live above poverty and support my family and be able to live comfortably in the city. Not without the uncomfort in knowing what's happening to my people, but I told you I sleep very well because I know the work that I'm doing on a consistent basis to have that impact and that change. The other value that I'd like to talk about is social value. That's kind of the value of connecting with others. You know, as a young banker, I just entered 30 years as a banker. And as a young banker, something told me, Joaquin, when I would walk into banks, the only people that I saw that looked like me were the folks that were the tellers, the VPs, the decision makers, the commercial bankers, the mortgage loan officers. At that time, none of them looked like me. And so something in me said, you know what? I want to be the banker of the underrepresented. And that ended up putting me to be the banker of anyone that I felt that the antiquated system of conventional banking didn't really take their time to take care of. So of course, immediately that was the Latino, African Americans, but then I realized women, then I realized LGBTQ, then I realized just youth. There were just so many people that there was a disconnect from obviously the conventional banking system and those that it supported. And so for me, I made sure the fact that I spent nearly 30 years being deeply engaged in these communities, understanding them at such a nuanced level that today and even yesterday, I could even challenge these communities. Think about that. Imagine being white and working with the Black Chamber of Commerce or the African American Chambers and being there and saying, actually, you know what, I'm gonna respectfully challenge you. You saw me here on a Tuesday night, late night, doing technical assistance with your people. You see me roll up my sleeve. I've been here every day, day in and out working. And what I see and what I challenge you is the fact that maybe this is a different way. When you get to a point that you are so well respected in the fact that you've put your time in, that you can challenge communities, that to me has such social value and such social capital. The same thing happened to me working in my job right now and going into mostly white rural communities. And so in order for me to be in this position, I'm appointed by our governor and I have to be voted on by our state senate. And I had some real fair questions asked of me when I had to go talk to our state senators. And they asked me, what does a city boy know about rural communities? I thought that was the fairest of questions. And I told them, I said, you know, in my lifetime of a banker, I realized that I had to take pennies and stretch them so far to have impact. I had to take lemons to make the most delicious lemonade. I said, who else would you want representing your constituency but somebody that's taken so little and tried to have such a humongous impact? I've spent a significant amount of time in advance of this job understanding that disparity and access to resources is very similar in rural as it is to urban. People are hurting in rural communities. Imagine having to have a toothache and you know that you have to drive an hour to get somewhere, or not having childcare, or not having a way to get to work. Yeah, I could just keep going on and on in the rural communities. And rural communities have seen the work that I've done internally at WHEDA, from putting set aside of dollars for significantly rural properties and development of them, us redefining what rural was, because what we were seeing is that suburban communities were winning the resources for rural, where rural communities were not. And so we redefined rural communities. Right now that we're in the process of something called the Rural Workforce Housing Initiative, which is going into communities and challenging them to take responsibility and ownership of their housing issues. WHEDA's not going to come in and tell you what you're going to do. We need you guys to take responsibility and tell us what's important. And then we're bringing the non-usual suspects to the table to talk about housing. Most of the time it was somebody from the municipality, a developer, maybe WHEDA, maybe a banker, maybe a legislator. That's all would sit at the table, and then we would plan for the people. That's ridiculous. When housing impacts everybody. Today, we're seeing the educational systems, the health systems, employers sitting at the table with us and bringing not only their ability to move mountains, but even their resources, which is important. My social value again. The question is, can I, by the end of this conversation, compel you to think differently about equity? Do I present myself in a manner that you feel like, you know what, this guy is talking to me very authentically, very real. I really do appreciate the way that he's really presenting this information. And something about him is going to really challenge me to think differently about the way that I engage with equitably and different. And even through the national audience, I have the privilege of sitting on the board of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That happens to be the nation's most powerful financial regulatory board. And I'm from here, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I sit on the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago, the Consumer Advisory Board, and I also sit on the executive board for the National Council of State Housing Agencies. What's amazing with that one is that your friend, us, we are but of the same fabric. I'm in the process of creating a national agenda amongst all state housing finance agencies. That's what WHEDA is. And I'm leading the effort in creating an agenda on how do we get directly at the disparity of African American and Latino homeownership versus the disparity of in comparison to white homeownership. Lastly, the last value that I have here is the psychological value. And that's the extent to which what I create or resource allows communities to express themselves or feel better. And so an example of that is, I don't know if you guys ever heard of the acronym CDFIs. CDFIs are, I would consider, stands for, first of all, Community Development Financial Institutions. I would consider them like nonprofit banks or nonprofit lenders. There's about 19 in the state of Wisconsin. And what they do is, they don't have the same compliance and regulations as banks do. So they can take a lot more risks than banks do. They can bank startup businesses. They can bank smaller businesses. The way that they're able to do that is they get funds directly from banks and the government to help them, boast them up so that they're strong enough to do this very aggressive lending or a little bit risky lending. They also provide something called business advising or technical assistance. And so when I first learned about them, my mind was blown. I was like, so you mean I'm working for these conventional banks and there's these deals that I really want to do, but I can't? But you have a nonprofit bank that can do it? And so as soon as I learned that they were in existence, I went deep in. I ended up volunteering. I ended up getting involved from a bank capacity and making investments just as a member, which eventually turned into me being on the board of some, which eventually turned into me being on the loan committee, which eventually turned to me understanding that there was a national association so I can understand at a national level who they are, really learning very, very much what was going on with the CDFIs. But what I learned from them is that they were competing with me as a bank. And I'm like, I do the easy deals. Like, you guys are supposed to do the hard deals. And when I was already in the inside of these CDFIs, and I was trying to understand what am I missing out here? Why are you guys doing some of the easy deals? And the truth was that they just could not withstand a loss. If they lent $250,000 to a business and the business went belly up and couldn't pay it back, it would significantly impact that organization's ability to keep moving forward. Because these CDFIs, they're very small. Their loan portfolio size is maybe in the millions, but not that big, so they can't really withstand or sustain losses. And so I really started thinking, how do I help in doing this? And so some of the things that I started doing is putting dollars towards, when I was working at the bank, is I said, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some dollars, but you can't use this CDFI. You can't use these dollars to serve your clients. I need you guys to think about, how do you build your own capacity? Do you need training? Do you need loan software? Do you need some accounting work? What do you need to do that? And then I also ended up providing some investments to increase their ability to lend also. And what was interesting is the fact that it ended up bringing other banks, because they saw the successes we had, and then other banks started sniffing and saying, hey, what's going on here? And then all of a sudden you saw other banks making significant investments. And it was just impressive how banks began to spend more and more time with the CDFIs. And it was great that they were then able to express themselves and feel better at the fact that they were able to get that attention. Now at WHEDA, what we're doing is doing the same, but at much higher level, and understanding how we can build the capacity of these CDFIs to do more. And it's impressive the type of work that they can do. Just last week, I spoke to the Association of State Philanthropy Organizations. I did research on our CDFIs. I presented it to the philanthropy organizations, letting them know about them. And right now, philanthropy organizations want to learn how they can help the CDFIs. And so, there's that kind of, any way that we can use an organization or our own ability to build the clout and build that ability for folks to really recognize that they are important. That's that psychological value that we can bring to the picture and to the whole game. So I appreciate if you all continue to think that way. And so I'd like to end on something that I call the what if factor. And to me, the question is, what if you thought equitably in your practice going forward? What if? What does that do? How does it change the game of all the disparities we see today? So you see, and I'm sure you read recently around the fact of the changes in demographics in all of our states. I think out of all the states except for one, every state is becoming more diverse. What does that mean in your work going forward? In the state of Wisconsin, we've seen an explosion of the Latino and Asian communities. That that in itself, what you defined at it, what you hear there maybe is, okay, we have more people and it's becoming more diverse. What I'm hearing is, okay, so how do they live? What does economic development mean to them? How does that inform what a neighborhood should look like for them? How are they going to be engaged in those questions and engaged in what they need to have an ecosystem that supports their growth and their resilience? And those are the tough questions we're asking at WHEDA right now, so that when we move forward, we're thinking ahead and we're creating products today that is mindful of the changes in demographics. And so the question is, how do you participate equitably in that? How about the very big conversation of segregated and concentrated poverty and its impact on community development? If you look at Milwaukee, I think it's very evident, as we saw in the video around redlining. It's really obvious to see where there's concentrated poverty. But how does that show up in the future of your designing, the future of the way that you participate in economic development? I think, it's going to be really important that you look deeper into the data and understand, is there bias in the data? It's going to be important that we're engaging our communities and asking the right questions. But it's even more important in the work that you've done, that you have the ability to have a back and forth and that you're able to challenge the communities. There's got to be a healthy back and forth in order for us to think innovatively about how we can have impact. So then we ask the question again, how do you participate equitably? Rural communities. There is change happening in rural communities. Our rural communities are, as a percentage of the total demographics, is becoming older. And so what's happening there is the fact that, our elderly, they don't want to age in place, because if they can't afford it or if they can't take care of the house, like, where do they go? They don't have community-based retirement facilities like we would see in Milwaukee or Mequon, Waukesha, Racine, Kenosha. They don't have that in most cases. So how are we thinking about that? Also in rural communities, if you noticed, is that one of the reasons why we saw kind of the flight of white Americans is because at the same time, the jobs left urban cores and cities. And those jobs now, we find them in suburbs and in rural communities. And right now, rural communities, employers are screaming for employees. They just cannot find people because our youth are going just the opposite way. They're going back into, urban centers. And so the question is, how do you participate equitably? The conversation about displacement and gentrification, I will tell you something about this. That seems to be one of the most salacious, sexiest topics to talk about. But to me, when you're speaking about gentrification, you're talking about the peripheral. To me, the real issues and gentrification and displacement is very important. But the real issues is when you go right behind that to see where the significant poverty and the concentration of poverty is. Like, we will talk about this and we'll put so much time into the displacement and gentrification aspect of a conversation, but people don't really want to talk about the tougher part about it. The part where people actually are not being impacted at that point on gentrification and displacement, where there's disinvestment. So I ask you to make sure that you're thinking healthy about both conversations. So the question is, how do you participate equitably? The conversation of affordability. It is crazy what is happening today, even in Wisconsin. Yes, we are not San Francisco, we are not Chicago, we're not New York, but as poverty continues to increase in many areas, and the fact that in the last 20 years, the only type of housing we built was luxury market housing, like, there is such a disconnect and a need for a variety of and a diverse need of all kinds of housing. And so affordability is an important thing. Recently, the city of Milwaukee did, I think a couple years ago, they did a study on displacement in neighborhoods that are outside of the downtown area. And in the research, they realized that the fact that they did not see significant displacement because a lot of the housing that came up was new housing. So if you go into Walker's Point neighborhood today, you will see it's all brand new buildings that came up. So they're like, there's not an issue to displacement. But I challenged them as I sat in City Plan Commission to say, did you check into the displacement of small business? Because what we did see is the fact that there were a lot of small, affordable places for all kinds of small little businesses that once those buildings were taken up and those empty vacant places and had some small businesses in there, those small businesses disappeared and now replaced by newer businesses that really don't support those that are in low and moderate income communities. And so when we think about affordability, we can't just think about housing. We have to think about the whole picture, the affordability aspect of the type of businesses that are coming or that are there, and do we just see displacement in that? Because that changes the fabric and the feeling of a neighborhood. And then people say, okay, so you want to charge me $25 for a poke bowl, which I love it, by the way, but I can't afford that. I was talking earlier about this, access to transportation. It seems like the only cities that talking about access to transportation are the ones that are dealing significantly with issues of density right now. Like right now, Milwaukee in the last couple of years, now we're finally talking about housing as a crisis. We should be partnering that with the conversation of transportation. Because even if we solve the issue of housing and how do we affordably house people, how do we get them around affordably and equitably? Asking the question, how do you participate equitably? And then lastly, working, listening, understanding someone different than you. How do you participate equitably? And so I believe I'm coming close on my time here. And so I might be a little earlier, but I was timing myself, so that's not bad. And so what I will do is pause, and I very much appreciate the time for you to hear kind of like the inner ramblings and craziness of Joaquín Altoro. But I will pass it back to you all if we have any questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Joaquin. It's very inspiring and a lot of things for us to think. I'm imagining the easiest way actually is for the audience to turn on their video and they can raise the hands or they can raise the virtual hands so you can see who has questions for you. So for the audience, if you want to ask questions, you can turn on your video and we can see you. Here is Caleb. Or if you are not in the situation, it's easy for you to turn on the video. You probably can just raise the virtual hands or type your questions in chat. Well, while everybody is thinking, I guess, and typing, I have a very broad question, and I don't even know if the question is well framed. I have some rough ideas. Local governments in the United States are so fragmented. It's small, and they have to think about their tax base, the services they provide. And I think there is a gap between at the local level, the revenue and the services that local governments provide, and what the state can do to coordinate equitable development or equitable financing. How do you, as the CEO of WHEDA, to address the gap between the state level policy and the local level implementation?
You know, one of the privileges of my position is it's a cabinet level secretary, and to understand that is that the governor has a cabinet of those that run the different departments of the state of Wisconsin. And so the department that I run is this quasi-governmental agency. We receive no state tax dollars, so that's where the quasi is in it. And I feel that when we're having conversations, and I have the privilege of being in those cabinet calls, is really challenging us respectfully to think about where opportunity is. Sometimes what we think is when we look at poverty, we realize that maybe there is not opportunity. When we look at communities coming in, recent refugees, immigrant communities, communities of color, we might not think there's opportunities. We see that as cost centers and an expense to state revenue. And so to me, one example of that is that for the Southeast Asian community, the Hmong community, 3 states received a significant amount of those communities when they first were here, I think in the late 80s as refugees: Wisconsin, Minnesota, and California. St. Paul, I believe, has one of the highest amount of population of Hmong community. And what's interesting about that is that they've been an ability, there's so much, they had the ability to really start their own ecosystem, their own ecosystem from many ways, to a point that I could take you to a market that has 1 million square feet and has hundreds of small businesses in there that has tax base for the local area. It's just so impressive. There are developers that we just had a developer that does significant development in that area that is a Hmong developer, and we just did an interview with them. So the real question is understanding where the opportunity is, and so that we can plug into that, support that, so that it creates a tax base to be able to grow our economies.
Sounds awesome. And building communities bottom up. But this is my personal feeling. Building communities bottom up empower individuals and social groups that can empower the whole communities. I will pause here and just want to see if other people will want to have comments or questions or chats.
Well, Green, I mean, I'm not going to ask a lot of questions. I'll let that for others. But one topic that came up last year at the Urbano conference was the gentrification, and I was on a panel. And I have to say that, you know, some of the neighborhoods that I work in, when I asked the community about their concern for gentrification, they flip it around and say, "Well, Carolyn, we actually want development. You know, we don't think we have enough development." Are you seeing any of that in some of the communities that you're working with, either urban or rural, that they say, hey, think of us, and they're trying to attract development as opposed to they're concerned about the gentrification, I guess, topic?
Yeah, first of all, gentrification has 1,000,001 definitions and meanings. And so that makes it very, very difficult. I've heard people blame that gentrification on for COVID. It's just crazy. It's just all kinds of things, the ways that we define it. I think the difference, Carolyn, is the fact that when development comes into the community, who is it being built for? That's the real big question on that. I'll give you an example, is that when I sat on City Plan Commission, they were talking about how they were building the last spur of the Hank Aaron Trail that went basically right around the Miller Park and finished in Walker's Point. And the way that it was presented is the fact that now we have ourselves that something that closes the gap from the suburbs into downtown Milwaukee. And it was just getting on my nerves at the fact that whoever the person that was presenting it, you were so concerned on the fact that we were building this for those on the outside and not for those that could immediately enjoy this. You know, and so it was like a quick way from getting from Brookfield to downtown, instead just wondering, and I asked the hard questions. I said, so I walked this the other day in advance of us being here, and what I saw with my eyes is I saw a couple young Latino families walking their kids on it. It was beautiful to see that. I'm going to make the assumption, the fact that they lived the neighborhood right just to the south of it, and they were able to walk this. But the thing about it is, I didn't see any wayfinding for them. I didn't see somewhere for them to sit. I didn't see any type of way for them to engage their kids as they were there. It truly was what you designed it for. And so that's the question that we have going forward. The question of gentrification is, you know, I think some of the textbook definitions is seen kind of like that increase of let's say, of resilience, of value, of opportunity within an area. But the question is who is it for? That's the tough part. And that's why this conversation of an equitable approach to what we do, and I think is really important.
Hi,
I read some, go ahead, I apologize.
So I guess my question is, in everything you're saying here, you know, I think that there's a tendency to want to have a one-size-fits-all solution. And so when people from around the country are coming to you, how receptive are they to the fact that you kind of touched on in the last couple questions, but like you need to take a local focus. Like I can give you some tools that you might be able to use in your communities, but it really depends. Like, I can't give you a solution. The community, that the solutions come from the communities, and you need to kind of engage with them. So what has that reception been like, I think, from people nationally that have reached out to you?
I'm gonna be honest with you. I feel like we've hit it's just so hard. I'm in a lot of stuff that I'm involved with. I feel like a lot of people get that. Carolyn, you know, and with the work that you're doing, you've done that a lot where it's like engaging our communities first. I think a lot of people get that, but I think it gets a little bit more difficult than that. I do want you to take a moment to hear what I said about that healthy challenge going back and forth, because sometimes there are people that come in that have very qualified ideas that could really help move the needle. I'll give you a very specific example of that. I was doing a tour of some very large buildings in the very old, dilapidated, vacant industrial buildings in the corridor, right off of 26th and Capitol, Carolyn, that area. What do we call it? Century City corridor, if you will?
Century City, and then the other one is the Commons. Right?
So the Century City corridor. And I had a friend that, if you guys know Adam Carr, he was doing a video and bringing in people from the neighborhood to look at these buildings and envision what they should put there. And, you know, some of the folks in the neighborhood were like, not all of them, but there were one or two folks that were like, we should have a daycare or a McDonald's. And to me, the highest and best use probably would not been in that exact spot, daycare or McDonald's. And so the question is, as we engage, as we understand, there's a purpose why they said daycare to McDonald's. Daycare, you could get it. McDonald's, it wasn't really about McDonald's. It was just about the fact that they felt like they didn't have that much access to food outside of in their immediate neighborhood. And so hearing that and understanding that's important as a part of the master plan, but then challenging them and making sure that our communities understand that concept of the highest and best use determined by them and us collectively as to how we work that out is going to be something important. I will also tell you that it happens amongst the practitioners. I'll give you a real quick example of the fact of another time when I sat on City Plan Commission. There was a developer, it was it's the Housing Authority of City of Milwaukee. They were doing significant work over off of Silver Spring, and what they were doing is taking out a lot of this city housing that they have. They were knocking it down and coming up with different types of housing, from single family to duplexes to big multifamily, and they wanted to do mixed income also in that area. And it was pretty impressive. And if you go past it, it's really impressive to what it is today to compare to what it was in the past. One of the last buildings they were building was a leasing office in front, and in back, it was kind of just like the maintenance office. And it sat right in the middle of the development. And what happened is the architect came in and said, I am designing this beautiful building that, in a sense, it came over to me, like the neighborhood and the place and the people should be privileged that he did this amazing design for them. And I asked the simple questions. I said, you know, question number one, I said, do you know kind of the demographics of this neighborhood? Do you know what percentage of this neighborhood is either children or elderly? And had no idea. And in a general sense, in these, and even within communities of color, we are trending to be much younger. But even in this area, it is significantly, a significant amount, a very high percentage of those under 18 years old. And so on the backside, he had a lot of glass. It was just crazy. And I just said, the challenge that I'm asking you is the fact that kids are going to play. They're going to play in their backyard. They're not going to disappear that far. And the question is, how have you thought about children and their engagement with this building and the safety aspect of it? The good thing about it is the rest of the City Plan Commission agreed, and we challenged them to come up with a different design because of just not being considerate of those and the demographics of that, of who he was serving.
We still have about 10 minutes, and we still have a chance to take 1 to 2 questions.
If nobody's going to jump in, you know, also the work, everybody gets excited about the ideas, and the neighborhood is asking for development. What other financial tools can you recommend besides your housing tools, right? Because the challenge I have is like these, you have the momentum, the excitement, and then the market doesn't always support. So, yeah.
What I'm doing at WHEDA is creating something because the dollars that we have are very limited and they have to have an impact statewide equitably. And what I'm realizing though is that there are so many other people that care about these projects that need to come up in neighborhoods, but we're just at a lack of resources to build them or to realize them. And so what I'm doing at WHEDA is I've challenged my folks to create kind of a menu to show the non-usual suspects how they can invest in housing in different ways, because I think and I feel that philanthropy, health systems, education, pension funds, go right down the line, employers, all of them care and all of them want to see something happen. The issue is they don't consider themselves developers. Sometimes they don't consider themselves financiers. And so they may think, even like philanthropy might think that the only way that they can participate in any of this development is purely by just a philanthropic grant, if you will. But there's so many other different ways that one can make an investment, either by equity that's paid back, by equity or by debt that's paid interest back. And so I think the future of this is really trying to figure out who are the people that are impacted the most above the people themselves, but the system, the players, industry that are impacted, and challenging them as to the way that they will be involved, but not just immediately from a philanthropic grant style, because there's so many different ways. For us, we offer tax credits, and so banks and corporations. I'll give you a very specific example. A bank can purchase and invest in one of our tax credits, or excuse me, our tax exempt bonds. They can invest in one of our tax exempt bonds, and they can help us generate dollars to do more. And at the same time, they can get a tax relief, but they also get something else that sometimes they don't know that you can help them with. They get additional credit by the feds. And so the question is, if you understand, what motivates business and what's their motivation, and if you could tap into that, that is great. Right now, I don't know if people know, but since the Affordable Care Act from Obama, banks have to report back to communities differently. And so the way they do that is something called a community benefits agreement. They collectively have to say, this is the way that we're going to impact communities. And so the question is, who is challenging banking systems to think about that? Another way of thinking about this, Carolyn, is how are people saving money by making investments? And so right now, what we're seeing is big health systems are making investments in poor communities and impoverished communities. And the reason why is because people that are not insured or underinsured, they're going into the emergency rooms, and that is just bleeding the hospitals right now, because that's the most expensive place somebody can go in, especially for stuff that is not emergency related. And so hospital systems are saying, hey, we'll give dollars to nonprofit health clinics that are in these communities, and hopefully they'll work with these folks. So when those dollars come in, is that an ability for a health clinic to say, we're going to build out a health clinic, but then we're going to do housing, or we're going to do a park, or we're going to do a commercial kitchen? So it's really thinking about the motivation and thinking about the other players outside and asking how do they plug in, and helping them think of different ways that they may plug in. I hope that's a way of answering that.
I have a very quick, hopefully, follow-up question. Because I'm curious about the community benefit agreement. Because when I drive around, I live close to Silver Spring. When I drive around, I see a lot of banks, showing up. And as a planner, I was thinking, well, that means the neighborhoods here get more competitive and assuming better and more services. How about the banking or the financial services in other communities? And what exactly is required by the community benefit agreement?
Yeah. So it's actually called something different. It's a bank's commitment to something called the Community Reinvestment Act is what it's called. And basically it's a law that states how banks should be engaged with low and moderate income communities. The street that you were driving down, was that Brown Deer?
Whitefish Bay. to
Whitefish
the
Bay?
east.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you something that's really interesting. You will notice that when a bank crosses into a regional territory that has low and moderate income communities, the bank is now required to engage with low and moderate income communities. But if you look at where banks are plotted at Brown Deer Road, Silver Spring Road, you will notice that on the side of that's not Milwaukee, that's where all their branches are. But when you look on the side that is Milwaukee, the branches are not there. That's all done purposely in some cases so that they don't have to be able to do that. Now look at banks that are inside the city of Milwaukee. They have a they have branches in the city of Milwaukee. They have a responsibility to low and moderate income communities. And one can go to any branch and say, can I see your community reinvestment report? And in that report, it's supposed to be public information, and they say the type of work that they're doing in communities. And, you know, there's a lot of banks that are doing great work around that, but I think the system itself is antiquated because banks' responsibility is first and foremost not to low and moderate income communities. It's first and foremost to its shareholders, to its board of directors, and then to federal policy and compliance. That's who they're responsible first and foremost. And so if a bank sees that a low and moderate income community is an expense center to them, they may not put the energy that is necessary. However, banks that are innovative in their approach understand that I can work in these communities, we can have success in these communities, we can make money in these communities, and we can have impact in these communities. And it's not impossible. How do I know? Because I've been there, done that.
Let's see if we have one last question from the audience, or let me see the chat. Joaquin, there is a question from Jenny. I guess I will read it out. Can you talk a little bit more about a community benefit agreement? Well,
maybe I'll leave you guys with an interesting article I read, and this one's gonna get you guys thinking a little bit. You saw in the video that we were talking about integration. That was one of the keys that they said that we could absolutely potentially improve. However, there was an article recently that came out of New York Times showing that for Latinos and Asians, if they had the ability to choose where they want to live, they sometimes, in most cases, will choose to live amongst their own. And so the question here is, a lot of people think that integration maybe is the answer, but what if people want to live with their own? What does that do? What does that work? Now, concentrated poverty, in most cases, the conversation of segregation is people don't have the choice, you know? It's like, this is where the cheapest, most dilapidated opportunity, no access to education, health, and everything. Like, this is where we have no choice. This is only where we can't be because we can't live in, somewhere else. That in itself is scary and unfortunate. But when people choose to live on their own, what does that mean for the future of our cities and neighborhoods and economic development when there's this conversation about integration? And so I think it still could be bifurcated in many different ways. But when I read that article, I was like, this is very, very interesting.
And there is a research about, like, even in Asian neighborhoods, and Asian neighborhoods are classified by the economic classes. And it's very obvious in California, where there are a lot of Asian communities. Okay, we are coming up to our scheduled time, and I don't see any hand. I don't see any question in chat. So let's give Joaquin a round of applause. If you can applaud virtually, that'd be awesome as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good day.
Trying to get off of mute.
Have a good one. Thank you so much, Joaquin.